So, Namaskar and good morning. I, on behalf of NIDM, National Institute of Disaster Management, Ministry of Home Affairs, Government of India, and Nagaland State Disaster Management Authority, NSDMA, Government of Nagaland, welcome you to the first day of this 3-day online training program on early warning and communication for DRR&R, Disaster Risk Reduction and Resilience. And this will be from 25th to 27th August, and time will be same from 11 to 1 p.m. Myself, Dr. Raju Thapa, and I am engaged here in NIDM as junior consultant, and I will be the moderator of today's session. And just to give you a brief idea that early warning, is a major element of disaster risk reduction, and it can prevent loss of life and reduce the economic and material impacts of hazards, events, including disaster. And to be very effective, like early warning system, it needs to be actively involved the people and the community at risk from a range of hazards, facilitate public education and awareness of risk, disseminate and warning efficiently, and endures that this is a constant state of preparedness and that this early action is enabled. And our training program is also very much aligned in this concept. Just I will let you know also that the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction that was from the 2015 to 2030, which is the successor instrument of the Hugo framework for action that was from 2005 to 2015, which aims to build the resilience of nations and community to disaster, recognizes the benefit of multi-hazard early warning system and enshrine them in one of its 7 global targets. That is the sustainability, increase the availability of and access to the multi-hazard early warning system and disaster risk information and assessment to people by 2030. And the Sendai framework, it also, urges a paradigm shift in the way risk information is developed and also how it's assessed and utilized in multi-hazard early warning system and disaster risk reduction strategies and also the government policies also. So it states that in order to reduce the disaster risk, there is a need to address the existing challenge and prepare for the future ones by focusing on whether that is monitoring or assessment of understanding disaster risk and sharing some information on how it is created, strengthening our disaster risk governance and coordination across, relevant institutions and sectors, and the full and the meaningful participation of relevant stakeholders at appropriate level. And during our this 3-day online training program, you will find that all our lectures has been arranged in such a way, keeping in focus all these important parameters that we have discussed, right from the disaster information to risk knowledge. And we have also taken in some particularly considering the northeast areas, hilly areas. Also, we will be discussing about landslides. We will be discussing about earthquakes. So there are many more things to come in this training program. And at the end of the training program, I think you will be able to develop better understanding about disaster risk management, and you will be able to understand the need and gap in early warning communication for disaster situation. And we will also try to promote linkage among stakeholders from disaster management and nodal agencies for early warning and communication. And we will try to also discuss the possibilities for disaster risk communication system, what are the technologies and network, and for early warning system. And also we will also put some light on the effective implementation of early warning and communication related to disaster situation. And to discuss this topic in detail, today on the first day, we will be joined by Dr. Hari sir, who is not currently in the panelist list, but as soon as he will come, I will let you introduce you to the panelists. Currently, I will let me first introduce to my panelist list to you. We have with us Dr. Harjeet Kaur, who is my colleague and who is also the junior consultant here looking after the coastal disaster CDRR center. And we are also joined by my one more colleague, Sri Anil Katherji. He's also working here as a junior consultant. And later on, we'll be also joined by some other resource persons. So to set the training program in order, let us directly move on to our technical session. In the technical session, it's a humble request that all the participants please do actively take part in the training program. You can do so by raising your questions through the chat box or the Q&A window. Some of the time, due to time constraint, we are not able to take all your questions, but definitely we take a note of that questions and we will try to get back to you even after the program. So please use the chat window or the Q&A window to raise your question. So let me pass on the stage to my colleague, Dr. Harjeet Kaur, for the first presentation of this training program. And she will be enlightening us about the basics of disaster management. And she will be talking about the first component of early warning system, that is risk knowledge. And she will be highlighting about the HVCR. So let us pass on the stage to Dr. Harjeet Kaur. Over to you, ma'am. The stage is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much, Raju, for giving me this opportunity. Just give me the sharing so that I can share my PPT.
Okay, ma'am. Yes, ma'am, you have the sharing right.
Yeah, I think my PPT is visible.
Yeah, ma'am, absolutely.
Thank you. So today I'm going to deliver on the topic of basic of disaster management and HVCR. So before starting my presentation, I would like to spread the COVID-19 appropriate behavior. Please clean your hands with soap or water. If water is not available, then please use alcohol-based sanitizer. Wear properly mask and avoid touching of sensitive organ like eyes, nose, and mouth, and keep the physical distance at least of 6 feet, and clean surface regularly, and if possible then please get vaccinated. So here I am showing some images of hazard event that occurred in India. So first image is here, this one showing the flood inundated area. The second image showing the fire, forest fire. This one is the cyclone image, and this is earthquake after the earthquake. So this is showing how these hazards or event cause damages to our society. So we need to discuss what is hazard. So hazard is a rare or an extreme natural or human-made event that threaten to adversely affect human life, property, or activity to the extent of causing disaster. Then, when an event may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impact, properties, damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation, hazardous event is the manifestation of a hazard in a particular place during a particular period of time. So this definition is given by the UNGA in 2016. The next question is, how would you characterize an event as a hazard? So we know that if hazard may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impacts, property damage, social and economic disruption, or environmental degradation, hazardous event is manifested. So then we characterized an event as a hazard. So next, here I'm showing a table where you can categorize uh, different type of event or under the hazard category. So first, I have mentioned in the table is measles. So we considered measles as a hazard if it spread to the community and create loss to the community, then we considered it as a biological disaster. Then the next question is, does it have an impact on functioning of a community? Next is, are proactive and reactive measures available to manage these hazards? And does the hazard measurable special and temporal component, and is it complex hazard? So we need to identify these characteristics for any event. Here, like in the second position, I have mentioned the electronic waste. So still now, the electronic waste are not considered under the category of disaster. But thunderstorm, floods, and landslides, earthquake, floods, these are categorized under the hazard classifications. Yes. So next, this is a very simple thing where we need to learn that a hazard is turned into a disaster when the people in the danger zones are vulnerable and do not have the capacity to cope with the impact of the hazard. So in this image, we can understand the literal, the language of the definitions of hazard, vulnerability, disaster. So in the image, the figure one, this one, yeah, left side, first one. So you can see that the person is vulnerable due to Shillong. And diagonally, you can see in the this image that the house is vulnerable due to the rock fall. So here the vulnerability is a two different type. Here is a population, a man is this under the category vulnerability. And the house structure, this one, it is under the, we can characterize it as a physical vulnerability. Now, in this image, you can see that a boy is vulnerable due to the electric shock. And if a person or building damage or destroy, then it may lead to a disaster. So यहाँ हमें समझने की जरूरत है कि what is hazard, what is vulnerability, and what is disaster. Yes. Now, the categories of natural hazard. I have taken these categories from our NDMP plan, that is the National Disaster Management Plan of 2016, where they have characterized the natural hazard into 5 categories. So, first one is geophysical hazard, hydrological hazard, meteorological hazard, and biological hazard. Under the category of geophysical hazard, they have characterized earthquake, mass movement or earth material. Here it indicates mass movement means landslides. So then volcanoes, but in India, we are not more vulnerable due to volcanic activity. Tsunamis is under the geophysical activities, and under the hydrological hazards, flood, and here also you can see the landslide is mentioned because due to heavy rainfall or heavy rain intensity, it may lead to a landslide. So that's why they have and again characterized landslide under the category of hydrological hazard. Then third one is the meteorological hazard, where they have characterized as a cyclone, storm surges, cold wave, extreme temperatures like heat wave we faced, a cold wave we faced. And so these are under the category of meteorological hazard. Then there is a biological hazards. These are epidemics. Recently, we are facing a COVID-19 pandemic. So under the 5 categories, they have classified the natural hazards. Yes. The previous classification is done by NDMP, that is National Disaster Management Plan. And now I'm showing the disaster, or you can say the hazard classifications by the High Power Committee. So you can also download these documents from the NDMA website. So they have also characterized hazard into 5 category, but their the main topic or the main theme is different. In previously one, they have characterized as a geophysical and as a meteorological. So here, just in the combined way, they have characterized as a water and a climate related disaster. So under this category, they have flood, cyclone, tornado, hailstorm, cloudburst, all these uh, hazards are categorized under the water and climate related disaster. Now they have categorized another disaster is geological related disaster. So these are landslides, earthquake, dam failures, mine fires are there. So, and in the third category, they have characterized the chemical and the industrial related disasters. So mainly the CBRN falls under this category. So fourth one is the biologically related disaster. So basically these pest attacks, cattle epidemics, pandemics, food poisoning, these fall under the category of biological related disaster. And the fifth one is the accident related disaster. Under this category, they have classified the forest fires or stampede, oil spill, and a serial bomb blast, a festival related disaster like the Kumbh Mela, the previous one. So all these are categorized under the accident related disaster. Now, disaster. According to the UNICIDR, they have defined disaster as a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or a society involving widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses and impacts which exceed the ability of the affected community or a society to cope using its own resources. And according to the DM Act, they have defined disaster means a catastrophe, mishap, calamity, or a grave occurrences in any area arising from natural or man-made cause or by accident or by negligence which result in substantially loss of life or human suffering, damage to property, infrastructure, degradation of the environment, and uh, magnitude as to be beyond the coping capacity of the community of the affected area. So this is the definition of disaster according to the DMF 2005. Yes. So we have discussed the natural disaster, natural hazard also we can say. So primarily disasters are triggered by natural hazards or human induced or result from a combination of both. So the widely accepted classification system used by the DIM, that is the Disaster Information Management System, they have classified all these disasters. Like previously, I have talked the natural hazard as under the 5 category, the geophysical, meteorological, climatological, and biological disasters. So these are under the classification by natural hazard. So they have again, the second one is the human induced disaster. So basically, these are the chemical CBRN, that is the chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear hazard. And another thing also, they have added the fire, because it's always it induced by a human activity. So and these classify according to the NDMP notes that the rise in the population, rapid urbanization and industrialization development within the high risk zone, environmental degradation and climate change aggravates the vulnerability to various kind of disasters. So the human society is vulnerable to these CBRN hazards. Yes. Now, level of disaster. So the disaster management and its planning at various tiers must take into account the vulnerability of disaster affected areas and the capacity of the authorities to deal with the situation using the approach, and the high power committee on disaster management categorized disaster situation into three levels, that is L1, L2 and L3, and L0 should be utilized for the disaster risk reduction. So here L1 is the level of disaster that can be managed within the capabilities and the resources at the district level. So however, the state authorities will remain in readiness to provide the assistance if needed. Then level 2. This signifies the disaster situation that require assistance and active mobilization of resources at the state level and deployment of state level agencies for disaster management, and the central agencies must remain vigilant for the immediate deployment if required by the state. Then level 3. This corresponds to a nearly catastrophic situations or a very large scale disaster that overwhelms the state and district authorities, and the characterization of disaster situation into level 0 to L3 finds no mention in DMAC 2005, but further in the DMAC does not have any provision for notifying any disaster as a national calamity or a national disaster. So these labels are further explained under the NDMP plan in 2016. Yes, now what is vulnerability? So we can define vulnerability as a degree of loss to a given element at risk resulting from the occurrence of a natural phenomena of a given magnitude. So vulnerability is expressed on a scale from 0 to 1. Here I'm showing you the table. Just suppose the northeastern zone, these are more vulnerable due to earthquake. So it's fall under the high risk hazard due to earthquake, fire, terrorist attack. Then under the moderate hazard, epidemics are less, road accidents are rare, rail accidents are rare, because in our northeastern region, I think except Darjeeling, there is no railway track. Then third one is the low risk hazard. So religious rites are very less in northeastern region. So I have just pointed out these kind of disaster for our northeastern region, how we can classify. Now, how we can assess the vulnerability. So with the two simple question, we can assess the vulnerability. First one is who is at risk. In the image, you can see I have pointed out the vulnerable population. So vulnerable population is at risk. Then what is at risk? So here you see I have mentioned the vulnerable infrastructure. So what is at risk? Infrastructure is at risk. So this is classified under the physical vulnerability. Yeah. Here types of different type of vulnerabilities. So we have classified vulnerability as physical vulnerability, social vulnerability, economic vulnerability, and environmental vulnerability. I have just give some example of these vulnerability, like our infrastructure, building, house, uh, road line, transportation. So these falls under the category of physical vulnerability. Social vulnerability, population, vulnerable population also we can consider, like our children's old age groups. So we can classify our data according to the vulnerability for a particular region. Then economic vulnerability, if a road is damaged, so it causes losses, we lost our economy, so we the government need to reconstruct it, obviously. Then environment vulnerability, the forest surrounding the forest areas, other things related to environment, biodiversities is also damaged due to different type of hazards. So let's discuss what is capacity. So capacity is the combination of all the strengths, attributes, and resources available within an organization, community, or society to manage and reduce the disaster risk and strengthen resilience. So this is our capacity. So in one line, we can say that it's the ability of coping and responding to reduce losses. Now, we need to identify the specific risk. So when we're talking about the specific risk, means identifying risk for a particular hazard at a specific geographical region. Suppose this training program is focused for the northeastern region, for the Nagaland. So we need to focus for the northeastern region, like they are vulnerable due to earthquake, landslides are there, forest fire are there, flash floods are there. So we need to focus for the specific hazard. So that's why I have mentioned the specific risk. So risk is equal to hazard into exposure into vulnerability. And all the definitions I have explained you earlier. Yes. Now, element at risk. We need to understand that the population, properties, economic activities, including public services, etc., at risk at a given area. So from this image, we try to understand the definitions of element at risk. So you can see that this is the harbor area, the sea coastal area, and from this is the satellite image, and you can find that there is the airport is there, residential areas. These patches shows the residential area. That means population is there, and these green patches are showing the agricultural land. So if suppose if there is any cyclone, that obviously these population or the infrastructure may be affected due to cyclone. So we need to understand and we need to find out the element at risk for the particular hazard for the particular region. Similarly, this image also shows similar things here with this painting through. What I am going to tell you that this is showing the waves. You can take it as a tsunami wave. So if these wave hit the coastal region, so just suppose this is the fisherman colonies. So these may be affected due to these waves, tsunami waves. Just take an example. So the population, cattle, animals, and their infrastructure is vulnerable due to the wave. So, and in the third image, you can see that there is a loss of infrastructure and the death of population and the animals. So obviously it creates a disaster. So it's very good picture from where we can understand the what is hazard, vulnerability, and disaster. Yes. What is risk analysis? So risk analysis means the identification of undesired events that lead to the materialization of a hazard, the analysis of the mechanism by which these undesired events could occur, and usually the estimation of the extent, magnitude, and likelihood of any harmful effects. So what is response? Response, according to the Act, DM Act 2005, it defines the disaster response as the taking of an appropriate measures to respond to an event, including action taken and measure planned in anticipations of during and immediately after an event to ensure that its effects are minimized and that person affected by the event are given immediate relief and support. So the aim of response operation is to save lives, protect property, and make an affected area safe. Accordingly, response is the operationalization and implementation of activities to respond to an event and its aftermath. So what is recovery? I have mentioned the small slogan from where you can remember the definition of recovery: build back better. So disaster recovery is an organization method of regaining access and functionality of its IT infrastructure after events like natural disaster, cyber attack, or even a business disruption related to any disaster. You can take an example of COVID-19 also. So the pandemic variety of disaster recovery method can be part of disaster recovery plan. Now, what is preparedness? So disaster preparedness is refers to measure taken to prepare for and reduce the effects of disaster. Now, the vulnerability profile of our country. From the images, you can see that mostly whole region, from the upper Himalayas and northern Himalayas, they are suffer from earthquake. And I have mentioned a previous disaster that hit the particular region. Odisha is specific. These Bay of Bengal area is affected by the cyclone area. Even the Arabian Sea also hit by the cyclones. So Shillong earthquake. I have mentioned all the history of from where you can understand what is our country facing a different type of disaster. Maybe landslides, floods are there, forest fires there, and we need to understand. Yeah, from this, the high power committee suggested to disaster management three cases we need to taken up for the DM. So these are Himalayan region, coastal areas are vulnerable, northeastern regions are there, union territories, island and marine assets, and arid and semi-arid region. According to the high power committee, they have classified these. So from the point of view of administrative and logistical perspective, the Northeast region also requires a specialized approach. Similarly, the UN territories, remote islands and offshore marine assets need to be treated differently given the specific administrative and logistical challenges. So therefore, they have classified the 6 special categories. Also, I have mentioned listed out in the presentation. So these are the Himalayan region, coastal area, riverine area, northeastern region, union territories, arid and semi-arid regions. Yeah. Now, from the time to time, the central government notifies hazard-specific nodal ministries to function as the lead agency in managing the particular type of disaster. This and I have taken this table from the NDMP plan. So if you want to check this, you can download the NDMP from the NDMA websites. So like they have mentioned a different type of disaster. If biological disaster occurs, the nodal ministry who deals with this biological disaster is the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare. If the chemical or the industrial disaster occur, then Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change deal all these related disasters, CBRN. The cyclone tornado is related to dealt by the Ministry of Earth Sciences. Tsunami is also dealt by the Ministry of Earth Sciences. So I have mentioned all the nodal ministry who dealt with a different type of disaster. Now, the next slide. Recommendation from my presentation. First, I would like to say that we need to improve the understanding of disaster risk, hazard, and vulnerabilities through our lecture, through training modules, through pamphlets, whatever we can spread our knowledge. Then provide a clarity on roles and responsibilities of various ministries and departments involved in different disaster. And I have also shown a ministry, nodal ministry, that deals with a different type of disaster. It may be a natural or it may be a anthropogenic. Then we need an effective disaster mitigation plan, hazard assessment, vulnerability assessment, and risk assessment. Prevention preparedness activities have to be strengthened and people must be educated about the dangers and how to minimize them, if not avoid them. So thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. Thapa. If there is any question, so you can put.
Thank you, Dr. Harjit Kaur, for your wonderful presentation. And definitely, ma'am rightly said that India is prone to disaster and escalating disaster losses. And like you said, effective disaster mitigation is the foundation for effective disaster response and rescue. That was visible in your presentation also, and for reducing the degree of hazardous, impact on the population. And like you said, vulnerability definitely refers to the the people capacity to anticipate or to cope with and recover from the impact of an hazardous event. And you also rightly pointed out that in a hazard vulnerability assessment, systematically it will evaluate the the damage that that could be caused by a potential disaster, the severity of the impact, and the available our resources during a disaster, reduce the population vulnerability, and also simultaneously increasing the capacity to cope with the disaster. And you also made it very clear that an effective hazard vulnerability assessment plan is very crucial for successful disaster management, preparedness, response, and recovery. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your wonderful presentation. Currently, I could not see any question, but please hold on to us. If there are sometimes participant raise question little later. So if there are any questions, I will raise this question to you after all the presentations. So thank you very much for a wonderful session. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Raju.
After that, let us move on with our program. So now I'm very glad and I'm very humble also to introduce you to our next speaker, Dr. Hari Kumar sir, who is a civil engineer with more than 34 years of experience in the field of safe shelter, disaster risk management, and earthquake risk reduction. He's also the regional coordinator for the South Asia and is responsible for GHI working in India, Nepal, Bhutan, and Myanmar. And sir is very humble to accept our invitation in such a short notice and be there whenever we send an invitation to sir. So thank you very much, sir, for joining us. And the stage is yours, sir, for the presentation. Let me just pass on the presenter right to you, sir.
Thank you. Yeah. Stage is not at mine.
Definitely, sir. Now is yours, sir.
Thank you so much,
Yes, sir.
Rajuji, and it is a real honor to be here and be talking to friends from Nagaland and all across. And was very interesting to listen to Madam Kaur, and I hope there is not too much repetition between what we both are speaking. So let me just try to share my screen and. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, sir. Your screen is visible, sir.
Yes. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to Raju, you, and Dr. Surya for organizing this program, which is really important. And I'm glad that Nagaland SDMA is on board with this. There's been a lot of activities. I know Mr. Johnny has been the champion of disaster management in Nagaland for several years, and the results are there for all of us to see. So I'll be talking a little bit on earthquake resilient infrastructure. Basically, I represent two organizations here, Geohazards International and Geohazards Society. I'm based in Delhi, but I have traveled very much to the Northeast, been to all of the states and worked in quite a few. Even in Nagaland, our work has been limited to Dimapur, actually, in one of the hospitals there, and worked closely with the government of Assam, government of Mizoram, Meghalaya, and all. So let us quickly get into Geohazard Society. As I just mentioned, the not-for-profit organization we based in Delhi. And we work a lot in schools and in hospitals. Um, so I really don't think we need to talk a lot about earthquakes, because my session is on earthquake resilient infrastructure. But we need to understand that we are a part of the tectonic system, and the Indian plate is actually pushing in the northeasterly direction against the large Eurasian plate, and it is actually going under, as you can see in this picture here, creating the Himalayas, the mountains, the Naga hills, the Himalayas, entire Himalayan system has been created by this movement of the Indian plate under the Eurasian plate. And this movement, as you all know, is not a smooth movement, and creates a lot of earthquakes. And sometimes when there are a few earthquakes, over a long period of time, so we say that the place is due for an earthquake. So you can see this is the plate boundary, the Indian plate boundary. The black line is the plate boundary, and everything above the north of the plate boundary is in the Eurasian plate, and everything south of the plate boundary is in the Indian plate itself. And these stars which I'm showing are all earthquakes which have happened along the plate boundary. And you can see the northernmost one. This one is the 2005 Muzaffarabad earthquake, Kashmir earthquake. Then we have the Kangda earthquake, 1905. A big gap between these two, coming to then the Nepal earthquake of 2015, the Bihar Nepal earthquake of 1934, the Shillong earthquake, which Madam Kaur was mentioning, and then the Independence Day earthquake of 1950. We were very young, independent nation of 3 years old when this earthquake happened, and that was the last big earthquake to strike the Northeast, and definitely affected the entire Northeast, including Nagaland. And go along the plate boundary towards the south, you have 1941 Andaman Nicobar Islands earthquake, and in 2004 the tsunami generating earthquake of 2004, all along this plate boundary. So you can see this plate boundary has created a lot of big earthquakes. And if you are in the neighborhood of the plate boundary, chances are that you can be affected by a large earthquake. And the further away, they say that you are always in between two earthquakes in time. So the further away you are in time from the last earthquake, the closer you are to the next one. I mean, the last big earthquake in the Northeast was in 1950. It's already 71 years old now. The last big earthquake to affect the Northeast was 70 years back. So we have to be prepared for the next big event. And this is the seismic zoning map of India. The entire Northeast, except for Sikkim, is in seismic zone 5, the maximum risk zone, the maximum or severe risk zone. So where you can, there is no upper limit to the intensity of earthquake that can be felt in zone 5. Because each of the zones represents a particular intensity of shaking, in earthquake intensity of shaking. Like for zone 2, the maximum intensity of shaking which is expected is 6, and for zone 3 it is 7 intensity. And for zone 4, the maximum expected intensity is 8. But for zone 5, what is written in our code is 9 and above, so which means that there is no upper limit to the kind of intensities that can be affected in zone 5. There have been many earthquakes which have affected India. 1505 Lomosang earthquake in Nepal, 1720 Gharwal Himalayas earthquake, 1803 Mathura earthquake, and which is connected to the Qutub Minar here, because the top two minarets of the Qutub Minar, which you can see here, were knocked down by this 1803 earthquake. 1897 Shillong earthquake, one of the most devastating earthquakes to have occurred, and the kind of effects of that earthquake is well described in several documents prepared by the British people who were here at that time. 1905 Kangda earthquake, the biggest killer in Indian soil. 22,000 people died in that earthquake. When we talk about 1905, when the population was so less, and there were no multi-storied buildings to, badly built multi-storied buildings to kill people, but still we had 22,000 people dying in that earthquake. 1950 called the Assam earthquake, but actually happened close to the Arunachal-China border, and that earthquake was the last big one. Then 1993 Latur earthquake in Maharashtra killed about 8,000 people. 2005 Kashmir earthquake, which affected India and Pakistan. About 80,000 people died in that earthquake, mostly on the Pakistan side. 2011 Sikkim earthquake on a Sunday evening in September 2011, and the 2015 Nepal earthquake again on a Saturday in the middle of the day on Saturday in Nepal. So these were the earthquakes which have affected India. If you look at Nagaland and the seismic zoning map, it's very easy to prepare the seismic zoning map of Nagaland, because you take the map of Nagaland and color it red. Almost the entire northeast is like that. But what is important here is to see the kind of faults which are crisscrossing Nagaland and also nearby. So all these black lines, these are all earthquake fault lines. Each one of these are potent to create an earthquake, a large earthquake. Some are more than the others. Geologists will be able to tell which one can create a bigger earthquake. But it's very, very important to know that we are living in earthquake country as far as Nagaland is concerned. And the earthquakes that have been felt in Nagaland area is, I'm just showing you 1869, we had the Kachar Manipur earthquake, that was a 7.4 magnitude earthquake. 1897, the Shillong earthquake, quite strong, as I mentioned. It's really one of the strongest earthquakes felt in the country. 1918, this was in Bangladesh, but not too far from India, that we felt it very badly. Many of our states felt it. Sri Mangal earthquake in Bangladesh, 7.1. Then we have the 1950 8.6 magnitude Arunachal earthquake. This was also the largest, sixth largest earthquake in the 20th century, but it was felt widely across the northeast of India, in China and in Myanmar. So when you look at earthquakes, the list of earthquakes in various countries, we see that the magnitude of the earthquake is in the US. You see 6.2, 7.3, 6.4, and all that. And on the other side, human lives lost is 2, 3, 2, 60. 60 is the Notre earthquake in 1994. Notre earthquake, actually a bridge collapse. There was a bridge collapse, which in which it was a double-decker bridge, in which about 50 people, or 50 odd people were trapped in that building. So in that bridge, collapse of infrastructure killed most of the people in that earthquake. And you look at Japan, almost the same things, except for Kobe earthquake, where 5,000 people lost their lives. And then you come to the 2011 earthquake, which was a 9.3 magnitude earthquake. That was a 9.3 magnitude earthquake, one of the worst tsunamis we had seen, and a nuclear accident. Together, the death toll was 22,000 people in that event. But when you look at earthquakes in India, you have very small earthquakes. I mean, Uttarkashi earthquake was 6.6 magnitude earthquake, almost 2,000 people died. Latur earthquake was a rural 6.3 magnitude earthquake, 9,000 people died in that earthquake. It was in Maharashtra. Nobody expected an earthquake till then, September 30th, 1993. Jabalpur, small earthquake, 39 people. Chamoli, 100. Bhuj, 13,805 people died in that earthquake. So why is, the numbers so high, even for small earthquakes? Why is it the difference? What is the difference? And that is what Dr. Kaur was also mentioning, the risk at a place. And I will talk a little bit about risk at a place. And we have to imagine two cities. We saw in the previous slide that there are cities either in the US or in Japan. And comparing two cities, one in one of those two countries and another in India. And if you imagine that the same intensity of the earthquake strikes both of these places at the same time of the day, and let us also imagine that the populations of these two cities are the same, the results, will it be the same? The earthquake in Japan will be a small item in probably the last page of the newspaper saying there was a 7 magnitude earthquake and 2 people died, one of a heart attack, or one fell from a ladder or something like that. But the same earthquake happening in a city in India will cover the newspaper, will cover not only Indian newspapers, but will cover also newspapers across the world. So what is different? What is different between these two places? Madam Kaur mentioned a few things which add to the risk. So let us see what all constitutes risk at a place, and we can try to understand why it is different in different places. Hazard is a physical event. Hazard can trigger a disaster. It need not be a disaster. An earthquake which happened in the US, which killed 2 people, did not become a disaster. But the same earthquake, happening in an Indian city where thousands of people are affected, that becomes a disaster. So a hazard is not automatically a disaster. It can trigger a disaster. How? Because it can affect other things like vulnerability of our built environment. How we are building our houses, how we are building our infrastructure matters. How we are building it, whether we are building it according to our codes are good, and which means are we building it earthquake resistant, disaster resilient, or are we using the correct materials? Are we designing them right? Are we executing them right? And what kind of materials are we using? Latur earthquake became such a big disaster because of the nature of the construction. The construction, the rock is plentifully available in that area, in the Latur area. So they used large stones for walls, and even stone slabs for the roof. So they were not earthquake resistant at all. And when the earth shook, every house in those villages collapsed. People were sleeping. It was the morning, 3 o'clock. The earthquake happened at 3 in the morning. And it was the kind of material that was used for construction of the houses which killed people there. So how vulnerable is our built environment? Let us look at a few examples. You can see in our hill towns, we use a lot of rock, and that can come down. And in Gujarat, you see these other 2 buildings are the ones on the right are both from Gujarat, urban areas. Ahmedabad, zone 3. Ahmedabad was in zone 3. You are all in zone 5. If you are in Nagaland, you are in zone 5. Ahmedabad lost so many of these multi-storied engineers, which is actually, there was a engineer involved, but it was probably not well designed by that engineer, which is why half the building has collapsed on the top. And this entire school, Swaminarayan School, has collapsed and pancake collapse. Finally, you will see slab, ground floor slab, first floor slab, second floor slab, all together. There is no trace of anything vertical. And what will happen if people are trapped in between these slabs? Hardly any chance of escape. So vulnerability, and we are looking at our hill towns. You can see a vulnerability of the way we are building in our hilly areas. This is your neighbor Mizoram, and look at Aizawl, the capital of Mizoram. They have not spared an inch of space, and if they have not built it, it is because it is a vertical cliff. Otherwise, they would have built on it, because the city is growing very, very rapidly. From less than a lakh to 4 lakhs plus has been the growth in the last 10 to 15 years, and people need space to live. And these are not, single story, double story buildings. If you take a closer look, like here, you can see many of these buildings are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 storied buildings. Take a closer look at how densely packed these buildings are. Isn't Do you see the danger in constructing like this? I mean, and when if I have a plot of land in the middle of this space, how am I going to construct my foundation without affecting the houses above and below? And it is a real dilemma. And I saw a site being developed, and I saw that when this person was developing his site to build a house, he had cut the foundation of the house above. You see, the foundation of that is lying on the ground below. And he has just cut it, and possibly while he constructs, he might build it back and connect it with a band-aid or something like that, because it is not going to be the same as constructing it when you are doing it. And this man who is living above has no problem with this, because he himself has cut the house above, the foundation of the house above. So that is the way things are done in hill towns. But and once this house is constructed, nobody will know that the foundation has been cut and all. But when the earthquake happens, the earthquake will know which house is being constructed poorly, which has been constructed well. And sometimes even a house which is constructed well will be damaged by a house above coming down and collapsing on it. So our vulnerability of the built environment, especially in hilly areas, I think it is a big concern for our northeastern states where there is a lot of hilly areas. And you have infrastructure which are supposed to be disaster resilient. You can see this photograph from Nepal which says the school area drive slow. But where is the school? You don't even see the school because the school building has collapsed. Nepal was really, really lucky to have that earthquake on a Saturday, because that was Saturday is the only day, non-working day for schools in Nepal. They are open even on Sundays. So it was really lucky that when all these schools collapsed, there were many school collapses in Nepal. And when that happened, the children were not in schools. So we are looking at disaster vulnerability of the built environment. Even our roads is part of our built environment. We're talking about, disaster resilient infrastructure. You can imagine what will happen to the people who are living uphill of this. I mean, imagine there is a city up there and the road connection is gone. Roads are so vital to the functioning of hospitals, of everything. I mean, and roads not only is a transportation issue, because and also rock falls. This is a victim of a rock fall. This bridge, you will all remember seeing the video on WhatsApp where a rock fall in Himachal Pradesh, not too big sized rock took a direct hit on this bridge across the river, and actually the bridge collapsed. The infrastructure was lost because of rock fall. So when you're talking about roads and bridges, these are not only carrying people from one place to another, they are also carrying electrical lines alongside, on the sides, main electricity lines, water supply lines. You can see the water supply lines, communication cables are all going along the road. When one road is lost due to a landslide, here it is a landslide, and many earthquakes also induce landslides. And when that is lost, we lose not just the road, we lose electricity, we lose water supply. So it is a complex issue, and disaster resilient infrastructure means resilience of all of the infrastructure. And then we look at the example from Japan. We're looking at a building here, a white building right in the center of the screen, which this is a photograph after the tsunami had passed. And you can see this building had just withstood a 9.3 magnitude earthquake. and then a tsunami passes through, not passes through, passes above, which is how this big ship was deposited on top of that building. If you look closely at the building, I don't think it has been affected a lot. That is resilience for you. That is, where the vulnerability is so low that the buildings can survive. Of course, you look around, the other buildings are all gone, but this must be a critical infrastructure, and the Japanese know how to take care of their critical infrastructure. The next element, which also Madam Kaur had mentioned, is the capacity of the people, capacity of the community to respond to a threat posed by a hazard. And I'm just showing an example from Afghanistan, a country which is suffering right now for other reasons. But this is from 2015, when things were near normal there, and the girls who go to school, and there was an earthquake, and it was not a big earthquake. And when I read that children had died in the school, I naturally thought it was the school collapsed. And when I read further, I realized the school had not collapsed. When the earthquake happened, the children, because there was no preparedness planning in the school, they ran out into the single staircase, and one girl fell down, another on top, and then there was a stampede in which 12 children were dead. And it is a lack of capacity of those children of that school and the community not to have had a preparedness plan. So that is an important part of risk. Madam showed this slide. A hazard turns into a disaster when people in danger zones are vulnerable and don't have the capacity. So she talked about how hazard can turn into a disaster because of vulnerability and capacity. And let us try to put these together into another equation. Madam showed one equation. See, all these equations which we are showing is not a E is equal to mc square kind of equation. No, not at all. This is only for you to understand, for us to understand the connections between the various the vulnerabilities, the capacity, and the risk. Hazard, risk, vulnerability, and capacity, we know the definitions now. So only thing we want to see here is the hazard into vulnerability divided by capacity is the risk at a place. And if you look at hazard, do we have any control over hazard here? Can we stop the earthquake from happening? Can we prevent a cyclone from hitting? We cannot. We don't have control over the hazard. So when you have control only over vulnerability and capacity to reduce risk at a place, what should we do with the vulnerability? To reduce the risk, we should decrease our vulnerabilities and increase our capacities. That is what we should do to reduce the risk at a place. So risk reduction involves vulnerability reduction and capacity building. Today we are doing the capacity building part, and we are hopeful that with the lessons that you learn from these sessions, you will take up the risk reduction and the vulnerability reduction part of it. So infrastructure earthquake risk mitigation, we need to increase capacities. Awareness generation is important. Why? I mean, you would be seeing many videos coming in from North India where you are seeing landslides. And one thing which is very, very common in all these landslides is that these photographs have been taken from roads. And it doesn't need, you don't need to be a trained geologist to understand that we possibly, when we were constructing these roads, we possibly disturbed the hillside terrain, and that is what is causing these landslides. And so we need to increase our capacities. We need everyone to have awareness about how to actually do construct anything with earthquake and disaster resilience. And training is required for everyone: architects, builders, contractors, engineers, financiers, industries. Everyone needs to improve their capacities if we have to build our infrastructure disaster resilient. Everyone needs. And decreasing our vulnerability means one is that we have our inherent, the stock of buildings and bridges and infrastructure that we have inherited from the past. We have made in the past, and many of them have been made without disaster resilience. So we need to look at that, how we can address the disaster resilience of that. But more important than that is ensuring, deciding, if Nagaland SDMA decides that, no more infrastructure will be built in our state without disaster, considering the effects of what can happen, without understanding what can happen, then you are not increasing your vulnerability, you are not increasing your risk. We have an inherent risk, and we have to, build as per the code and build as per the building regulations. Lifeline structures, your lifelines. What are your important structures? We saw the lifeline building in Japan. What are our infrastructure which are lifelines? A hospital is a lifeline, I would say. If a school has been designated as a shelter post-disaster, then that becomes a lifeline. Your water supply, lifeline. Your fire services, lifelines. Electricity, lifelines. Health services, all, not just hospitals, entire health sector, lifelines. These have to remain functional. It is not enough that they remain safe, they have to remain functional. We'll see how. Existing buildings, existing infrastructure will probably need to be retrofitted, made safer against earthquakes. And we also have to look at what can happen within those infrastructure, because we are in earthquake-prone areas. Falling hazards is also important. We'll talk about that a little bit. When you look at ingredients for a safe city, it is a very complex web. One is the built environment needs to be safe. That means your buildings, your infrastructure have to remain safe. And that is connected with the community remaining safe. If you have all poor infrastructure, even housing is really vulnerable, then community remaining safe will be a problem. May not happen because there will be a lot of losses. And if there is a lot of losses, then the health facilities, if they don't remain functional, then it is going to affect the losses in the community. Just imagine you have, like in Bhuj, what happened? Bhuj is Kutch, where Bhuj is one of the largest districts in the country. I think it is the largest district in the country. It is bigger than some states. And that had, at that point of during the earthquake, there was one major hospital which collapsed. Which collapsed in that earthquake. And because that hospital was not there, how many more people would have lost their lives? How many more people would have lost their limbs just because we didn't have a hospital to take them to? So health facilities remaining functional directly affects the safety of the communities. And now we come to the lifelines, water supply, electricity. If these don't work, how will a hospital work? A hospital, if I built the hospital building earthquake resistant, but I don't have electricity, I don't have water, what use is that building? But what I'm trying to say here is infrastructure and community resilience are so interconnected. Everything is connected to each other. Much of our water supply in our hill towns are pumped. And if electricity fails, the pumping stops. And if the pumping stops, the water stops. If electricity and water fails, the hospitals stop. There is a big web of connectivity between these aspects. Roads remaining functional. If roads are not functional, and I have lost a transformer, which I need to repair, but I can't even reach there because the roads are not functional, my electricity is not going to be restored anytime soon because the roads have to be repaired first. And the road is fine, but the bridges have fallen. How do we get across? All of those. So there's a big interconnectivity, interdependence between infrastructure, which we should discuss. We see an example from Bhuj earthquake only of one building which is completely razed to the ground, while the other building looks like it has not even been touched. The one which is standing is the government building, CPWD constructed in Bhuj, and the other one was a private structure. And just showing this slide to show that it is possible to build earthquake resistant building. It is just a matter of following the codes. But what happens inside the building is also as important. So I'll just show you a few seconds video of what happens inside a building during an earthquake if it runs. What happens inside a building? You can see from the Kobe earthquake in Japan in 1995. So let us see if it is running. Yeah. This is the earthquake as it happened. Cupboards are falling down. The tables and cupboards which are on wheels are just jostling around. Same thing in slow motion now. You see the cupboard falling down. If this kind of movement happens within our hospitals, you can imagine in an operation theater, in a generator room, if this kind of shaking happens, do you think the hospital will be able to continue serving the community, continue with operations? There are many things which can go wrong in hospitals inside a building, even if our building is safe. So building need not collapse for an earthquake to cause losses. You can spot these hazards in a school infrastructure. I was telling ma'am, this is from Guwahati, seismic zone 5. And I was telling ma'am, these shields which are behind you, no, you seem to have kept them for the small earthquake, because any one of these falling on somebody's head can injure them really badly. And for the large earthquakes, you have these big cupboards, and you have even kept a trophy which can hit a guest who is sitting in front of you. And if you look at this hospital, you see this is the entrance to the burn wall. We saw these photographs earlier. We probably were not aware of what would happen here. If you look at this photo, now you will understand in an earthquake shaking, what will happen to these oxygen tanks. These will all be falling forward and blocking the way to the burn wall. So can we exit safely after an earthquake, keeping a cupboard, an old cupboard? We, really don't understand the sanctity of corridors, which are our emergency exits, staircases. Many a time we use them as storage spaces. Old cupboard, put it in the corridor or in the staircase. And what happens during an earthquake is they fall down and block the exits, and people will not be able to evacuate quickly. So options for reducing risk, we need to anchor, brace, or restrain against the shaking. Relocating this is, I think, don't keep anything in these corridors. Relocate things which can block exits or kill someone. Anchor objects, which you cannot move. I mean, like in a library, you cannot move all the cupboards out. No, you have to anchor them to the wall so that they don't topple and fall on somebody's head and injure them. And if you have pipelines, I mean, especially very, very important when pipelines move from one building to another, and these buildings don't behave the same way during an earthquake shaking, the pipeline gets stretched, by the shaking of the buildings, and they break. And we lose water supply, we lose oxygen supply, and the only way is to allow it to move. Give it a little bit of flexibility, like this pipe. This is the new Bhuj hospital, where you have the fire line going from one building to another. There is a little bit of flexibility given. So it's allowing it to shake. It won't break. And this is the same case here in a hospital. Oxygen supply lines, which are connected to, this is a two-story building, and the oxygen line is going through a shed. So the way the shed moves and the way the building moves are going to be different. And the pipe, if it is connected to both, it's going to break. You're going to lose oxygen supply for our patients. So the only thing is that between these buildings, you need to give it a little bit of flexibility. And for major pipelines as well, pipeline infrastructure affected by earthquakes, I mean, they can twist and turn and be lost. Here, if you look at the Trans-Alaska oil pipeline, they understood that this pipeline is crossing a very, very important fault. The United States, their geological survey, they estimated that about horizontal movement, about 20 meters of movement, they expected to happen in earthquakes when this fault breaks. They expected that it might move about 20 meters. And so what they did was they created this pipeline and gave it the flexibility to move with the earthquake shaking. And it could move. And it was actually tested by a major earthquake which struck Alaska last year. And nothing happened to the pipeline because it moved. It moved with the earthquake shaking, and the shaking did not, I mean, it was not a 20-meter move in that earthquake. It was less than that, 15 meters or something. And the pipe is designed for higher shaking than that. So this is an understanding of what can happen and creating infrastructure around what can happen. You understand the risk first. Understanding the risk is so important. This is an example from Chennai. This is a hospital which is right on the banks of the river Adayar. And in 2015, when the Chennai floods happened, the river flooded, and this hospital lost patients. 18 people died in this hospital. Why? Because the water rose and flooded the basement. And what was in the basement? Their generators. So electricity had failed in the area, and when the basement flooded, the generators stopped, and people on ventilators, 18 people on ventilators died, only because somebody had not understood the hazard very well. Somebody had not understood the risk very well, that, okay, right next to the river, I should not have my generator in the basement, which can be flooded. I should keep my generator above where it cannot be flooded. The Japanese also make mistakes, like we saw in the tsunami in this hospital. I mean, if you look at the hospital and everything around it, this hospital is one of the only buildings which survived in this area. But it still lost patients. It still lost patients because of a miscalculation in the design. Because when they had designed it, and the the estimate of the tsunami height was 2.8 meters. And hence 2.8 meters, one of our floor levels is 3 meters, one floor. So what they did is they considered that, okay, let us double that. And they kept their generators on the third floor. You know, ground 3 meters, first floor 3 meters, 6 meters, and then they kept the generators. Little did they know that this 2.8 meters was a complete miscalculation. Their tsunami height, which hit them, was close to 13 meters. And hence it completely wiped away their generators. It also took away some wards. People died in that hospital. You know, even after building it earthquake resistant, it survived the earthquake, but the design, they did not understand the risk completely. It's very, very important to understand risk when we are doing critical infrastructure. So to keep it functional, we need to understand risk, we understand effects, and also secondary hazards. You know, will the earthquake lead to a landslide? Will the earthquake lead to fires? And understand the scenario of what can happen, and then design accordingly, build accordingly, prepare your staff accordingly, and keep your buildings safe and keep your facilities safe and functional, and understand the effects on the utility. So you should have backup. If you, you know, your emergency operations center is dependent on getting electricity from the electricity board, but if you feel that they may not be able to supply during an emergency, then you should be self-sufficient. You know, we now talk about Atmanirbhar Bharat. We have to be Atmanirbhar. Each individual critical infrastructure facility has to be Atmanirbhar. We have to be able to survive for several days without external electric supply, external water supply. We have to be able to survive on our own and still continue to function to be able to provide services to the rest of the community. And as I mentioned earlier, there is a lot of interdependence between these critical infrastructure facilities, and hence it is very, very important that we come together. You know, the electricity people, now what is happening is the electricity board is on its own. The water supply guys, they work on their own. You know, the municipality people work on their own. We all work in different silos. It has to be everyone coming together to make our city resilient, because we cannot you know, work in separation. These are because of the interdependence of these electricity system, the water supply, the transportation systems, the communication systems, and they are all dependent on each other. Water supply and communications need electricity. Emergency electricity needs fuel, and fuel has to be transported by road. Electrical equipment which has to be replaced have to be replaced by road. So there has to be a lot of coordination, and the coordination relies on communications. So this interdependence has to be understood, and people have to be working together. It cannot be, you know, just people working in silos. Here, the picture of in Aizawl, as we were developing a scenario of an earthquake, we had everyone working together, the water supply guys, and this was one of the first times they all worked together. It was excellent that people who were living in the same city, but you know, one was working in the electricity department and one working in the water supply department, had never sat and worked together. And it is so important for the resilience of the city that these people start working together. And the planning has to be comprehensive. Multiple sectors, infrastructure sectors have to understand and mitigate risk. And there is a need for long-term plans. We cannot be, you know, just doing, okay, let me do one training, let us do one assessment. No, let us plan for the next 15 years, 20 years. I mean, what infrastructure? India has a wonderful website where we have an infrastructure pipeline. We are thinking of the future, what all we are going to add in the next few years. Our planning also should match that, you know, and it has to be where all the sectors come together. No one is safe till everyone is safe, and also even the families need to be prepared of all the critical infrastructure stuff. No one can say that it is not my job. You know, much like the person whose job was to paint the line on the side of the road. When a branch was there on the side of the road, moving that branch, no, that is not my job. I will paint around it. We cannot paint around disasters. Everyone has to work in disaster management. We have to include disaster management in everything we do. It cannot be my job. It cannot be not my job. So thank you so much. Let us prepare and prevent, than repair and repent. I hope we have been able to give you a glimpse of disaster resilient infrastructure. Thank you so much, Raju. Over to you.
Thank you very much, sir, for such a wonderful presentation, sir. I was just admiring your presentation, sir, like the pictures that you have shown, sir, and the details that were there, sir. It was really, really wonderful. And given that, sir, what you have said, Nagaland is considered as a very high risk state. I think that whether the city like Kohima, which is the capital, they can survive a major earthquake. And like, although earthquake cannot be accurately predicted, like the future threat across the Himalayan belt, including Nagaland itself, has been, you know, sir, like the forewarned through scientific explanations and past trend also. And like, sir, you discussed very nicely, sir, that the Nagaland with the rest of the northeastern state fall under the earthquake zone 5, making it a very high risk state. Another vulnerability of Nagaland is the increased concentration of population, which you know, some of the figures, and I can correlate with it, Nagaland, particularly in Kohima, since I was there. So that the concentration of people in the hazardous environment, particularly the hazard like vulnerable to landslides, earthquakes, it is really one more vulnerability. And this is also another cause of some concern, because many people are still unaware of the dangers of the concentrating in hazardous areas. And more worrisome, sir, what I think is also that the more of the structure in Nagaland, whether it is like private particularly, and even some government has been constructed without proper planning and expert consultancy. And above that, the land use planning has like little been considered for various developmental like activities. So that all thing were very much clear, sir, from your presentation, sir. I think that was a very wonderful presentation, and we learned so many things from that, sir. So there is particularly only one question, sir, from one participant, sir. Should I raise that question, sir?
Yeah, yes.
Yes. The question is from Sir Atanu Ghosh. He wants to know, sir, is there any guidelines for this type of infrastructure building in India for each earthquake zonation? Are there any guidelines to follow, sir?
The Bureau of Indian Standards has extensive codes, and codes are there for each level of infrastructure. Every infrastructure is covered. The NBC covers this. And we have even the earthquake code IS 1893 has separate sections for water tanks separately, for buildings separately. So each kind of infrastructure will have different guidelines, and our national building code covers it all. But some of the there are also NDMA guidelines, National Disaster Management Authorities guidelines, for especially for hospitals, construction of hospitals, because NDMA guideline says that we need to actually go beyond what is mentioned in the code for hospitals, because hospital is an important building which needs to be functional. I mean, I kept repeating the word functional for critical infrastructure, and for keeping hospitals functional, the NDMA guideline provides some very useful guidance. So there are guidances, but these are not all together in one unit, as you know, guidance for infrastructure. But for guidance for water supply is different, electricity is different, but it's all part of the Indian codes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us and enlightening us in this very important topic. Thank you very much, sir.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, dear participants, with that being said, now we move on to our the last presentation of today, and I will be delivering the last presentations of today's session, and I will be talking about the basics of early warning and communication. And let me just share my presentation. One second. So I will be talking about the basics of early warning and communication. So here we will try to focus on what are the various components of early warning system, what are their roles, and what are their responsibilities also. So but before we move ahead, let us try to understand that India is witnessing a resurgence of COVID cases also. So we have to follow the basic precautions measures to reduce the risk of infection with COVID-19. So please maintain physical distancing wherever possible. Use a face mask, make it a mandatory for yourself. Practice frequent hand washing. Even when your hand are visually, it doesn't seem dirty, but use alcohol-based sanitizer wherever possible if you don't have that access to hand washing. And please also follow respiratory etiquettes to be strictly, because and dispose of your cough, sneeze, handkerchief or tissues very safely, and also do regular self-monitoring of your health. And if you think you have any symptoms, please go for immediate checkup. And of course, if available, wherever available, get yourself vaccinated at the earliest. So before we directly jump into the topic, since our two earlier speakers has already said so many things, so let me just give you an idea of how the disaster events have increased in the past 40 years. So as the report from the CRED, we call it Center for Research on the Epidemiology of Disaster, and UNISDR over the last 20 years, more than 7,000 disaster events were recorded worldwide. And if you just compare this data, 2000 to 2019 data, with the earlier 2 decades data, that is 1990 to 1999, you will understand that there is an almost double an increase in the number of disaster occurrence in recently. And there might be 2 reasons for that. First one is definitely we say that climate change, because of the climate change, there is an increase in intensity and frequency of disasters, definitely. And one more thing that could have been the cause of such a high increase in number is the increasing knowledge among the people. Now people, they are reporting the disasters. So in earlier cases, some of the times, because of the not availability of information, some of the disasters were not recorded. But nowadays we are recording every disaster, so that could be also a cause of such a high number. But if you just notice, if you just concentrate in the number of total death, you will see that though the number of disaster has doubled, but the number of deaths because of the disaster event still is the same, almost same. One of the main factor that is contributing to that is the early warning system. Now people are already aware, or they have some prior information in some of the disasters about the disaster happening, or they have some level of preparedness and some level of awareness about disaster. So that is also playing a very, very major role in decreasing the number of death. And also, if you see, there is a clear evidence that there in the world, there is a like global temperature is increasing. And if you see currently in 2019, it was reported that it is around 1.1 degrees Celsius about the pre-industrial period. And this impact are being felt in increasing, whether it is frequency of extreme weather events, including the heat waves or drought, flooding, winter storm, talk about anything. So there is an increase in frequency of that. And if you see worldwide, flood are the most common type of disaster, which account for more than 44% of the total event. And in the last 20 years period between 2000 to 2019, like more than 7,000 disasters were reported that I have shown. And if you see in this figure, you understand that Asia suffered the highest number of disaster event, as you can see. And the high frequency and impact of disaster in Asia is largely due to its first thing is the size of the continent, and also the landscape that represent a high risk of natural hazard. Such as the river basin or the floodplain and the seismic, fault line, all this. And additionally, there is a high population density also, which Harish also very nicely explained in many disaster-prone area, particularly of the continent, of the entire Asia continent. And typically, India and China, they dominate the list of countries by impact in absolute numbers, largely due to its massive population. Also, because we know, if you talk about the 2 largest countries with maximum number of population, India and China. So together, these 2 nations, it accounts, more than approximately 70% of the global total. So they account for a large portion of affected numbers. And one more important point is that the disaster disproportionately it affects those with the lowest socioeconomic status, including like those suffering from poverty, as well as minorities and discriminated groups, or we call it you consider the case of disabled people. So in many developing countries, women they with lower socioeconomic status, which implies an unequal access to information or health or and other assets, contribute to a reduced ability of women to cope with disaster. And this has also led to gender inequality in the death ratio and livelihood loss during natural hazard. If you go through a report in 2013 by UNDP, they have found that women and children are around 14 times more likely to die during a natural disaster as compared to men. So you can imagine that. And during the 2014, just let us take an example, the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, more than 70% of the victims were women. Or similarly, in 2008, cyclone Nargis in Myanmar, it killed twice as many women as age between 18 to 60 as men. And in 2005, not only in Indian regions, consider the developed like Hurricane Katrina, it affected predominantly, Afro-American women more. like who were less educated. So illustrating the fact that poor minorities are more exposed to natural disaster, and this gender wise also we need to focus upon it. Now, in India, the concept of disaster management has evolved from an activity-based arrangement. Okay, that was earlier a very temporary basis. So in the initial stage, the arrangement was a very reactive type. So basically, which means that in the standard approach, these organizations, humanitarian organizations and or other government organizations, they are very reactive. They reacted to any disaster. They started emergency relief operation once the disaster have struck and assistance was needed. But so similarly, if you consider any disaster, suppose landslide or the cyclone or the flood or the earthquake, tsunami, fire. In all these cases, we had a response like approach. But usually now, at least in relation to weather related hazards, we often have some information ahead of the upcoming disaster event, and this information, it can be interpreted and used to prepare the emergency operation more better. So in we call it early warning, early action. So in this early warning, early action approach, we make full use of the climate information that we have from our nodal agencies, and we also act in a way that prepare us better as a whole, but also with a more strategic approach to disaster response. Okay, so we'll discuss all this later on. So talking about like the disasters in India, some of the participant also has raised this question, and Dr. Hajit could also reply. So India definitely has a is very vulnerable in a various degree to a large number of, whether you say natural as well as human made or disaster, and on account of its very unique geographical and socio-economic conditions. It is highly vulnerable to flood, drought. You talk about cyclone. This year only we were hit by 2 cyclones, Yash, Totke, earthquake, landslide, avalanche, forest fire. All these are reality. All these things happens in India. And India is one of the, if you see globally also, top most disaster prone country in the world. And this country is prone to disaster due to number of factors, whether that is natural or whether that is human induced, whether that is, adverse geoclimatic conditions or the topographic features. You talk about the environmental degradation nowadays. You talk about the population growth, urbanization, industrialization, anything. So everything is contributing towards making us more vulnerable to disasters. So this is where early warning comes into play. So early warning strategies are this, the set of measures taken to increase resilience towards disaster. If correctly implemented, this early warning system can help us to reduce the losses of life and property, and it can also help us to minimize the environmental damage. So let us just cite an example. Let us understand with an example. Suppose there are actually many examples where you can see that public education and the rapid widespread dissemination of early warning system, it has saved thousands of lives. Take the example of 1970s cyclone in Andhra Pradesh in India, which killed more than 10,000 people, while a similar storm in the same area 13 years later killed only around 910 numbers. Though 910 is also not less when we are talking about human being, but definitely you can see the difference of that what I want to represent here. Then from 10,000 it was brought down to 910. This drastic difference was due to the fact that a new early warning system was connected with the radio stations to alert people in low-lying area, and that was put in place, and that had done a very important role in saving life by alerting people beforehand, before the time. So appropriate actions were taken. And the need of early warning system is not that is felt only in India. The importance of early warning system for global to local climate change adaptation and disaster reduction strategies has been increasingly recognized during the past 15 years. During this time, the early warning system has progressively received attentions within the framework of international treaties or conference and action plan. You talk about the Paris Agreement, COP21. Particularly this year, COP26, there was a very special focus, or particularly in early warning also, and also talk about the Sustainable Development Goal, SDGs goal. We talk about the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, SFDRR. or the PM 10-point agenda. In all these, you will see that a special reference and importance has been given to early warning system and improvement and making it available to the people. And so the first thing that comes to our mind is why do we need early warning system? So to give this answer in a layman language, we can say that early warning for disaster risk reduction is a very important matter of public policy at the highest level, whether it is national at the highest level. And particularly it is needed for two main reasons. The first one clearly is public safety and the protection of human life. And the second one is the protection of the national resource base and and productive assets, whether that is infrastructure and the private property or investment, to ensure this long-term development and economic growth. And conversely, if you see, by reducing the impact of disaster, a government, it avoids the financial and political burden of massive rehabilitation costs. And investing in early warning and other measures of disaster reduction is never simple, or it is not inexpensive also. It is very expensive, but it is said like that a dollar spent in early warning can save you $10 later on in of rehabilitation. So there are more benefits of doing so when you compare the cost of failing it. So as the definition itself suggests, that early warning system is much more than just forecasting in combination with network of transmitting the warning to the public. For an effective early warning system to be effective, the inclusion and interaction between four key elements is very, very vital. The risks knowledge, that is the first component, which was very in detail highlighted by both our eminent speakers who delivered their views ahead of me. And the second point is monitoring and warning services, and also the dissemination and communication. And the fourth one is the response capacity. So let us discuss all these one by one. So risk knowledge, when we talk about risk knowledge, the risk arises from the combination of hazards and vulnerability at a particular location. And for this reason, risk knowledge is a key element of successful early warning communication. While addressing the end user, the community, through an early warning system, it is fundamental that the importance and the potential of the system are well understood by the community itself. To achieve this, the public should also be informed about the risk communications, the channels, the emergency plan, and what are the risks, what is the importance of hazard, the vulnerability. We have discussed in very detail in just ahead of my presentation, so I am not going to discuss on that, but you can understand the importance of why the risk knowledge is very important for the early warning system. Now let me shed some light on the second component, that is the monitoring and warning services. And most of the time when you talk about early warning system, monitoring and warning services are most often comes to our mind. And this is the infrastructure actually that delivers the forecast and warning. And if you see, monitoring is nothing, it's collecting information along the sets of proxy variables related to risk. Suppose when you want to know about floods or drought, you will measure rainfall, right? If you want to know about earthquake, like Hari sir said, you will try to monitor the seismic wave. So this can be done through direct or indirect observations, and all these various means can be used, whether that is the satellite based, because now satellite technology is used extensively in disaster management. And whether you talk about the satellite imagery or the on ground point collection, or the the land based, suppose the Doppler weather stations or the automatic rain gauges, all that thing. Okay, all these things are used to monitor that, and all these informations, they are collected, and later on that they are processed by the expert to come out to a very meaningful outcomes from based on the data. And for many countries also, if you see, historical weather information and monitoring infrastructure already exists, but many belongs to different institutions. So there is an what I personally feel is there is a fragmentation of monitoring capacities also, as well as reducing the information available with when making forecasts. Like Hari sir also give an example where sir was doing the community service, and sir said like this, that was the first time so many departments come together. You can imagine like all departments have their own responsible, like own sets of information that they have collected from the people. If but those informations are like most of the time fragmented through different sections, different department. So what I think is the need is that availability of such information. There should be like all those information should be available, should be accessed by all the like particularly if I say the warning agencies, the nodal agencies, so that a very sound and very like accurate info like warnings can be delivered. Mm. Now once this the warning or warning is raised, now the warning needs to be disseminated to the people. And how it can be done, this can be disseminated via various users through different means, such as whether that is you can do that by telephones or telefax. There are police wireless also, there is radio, there is television. Now social media is also coming up as a very important tool in disseminating of like early warning forecasting. And our earlier like your websites, your emails, all these things are also used. Your mobile phone, SMS, we talk about SMS, all these things, or the print media also, newspaper, they also play a very important role, and particularly in issuing this warning and advisories. And other community radio also here, particularly I will say community radio can also play a very significant role disaster management through promoting the preparedness, warning, and also rehabilitation program. Community radio because they have an advantage because they can deliver, they can express the message, or they can transfer the message to the people in their vernacular language also. So that will be very much understood by the people itself. And the community radio, most of the time they are from the community itself, so they know the various hazards and vulnerabilities of that particular area more than the outside people. So sometimes they play a very important role in disseminating the information. One more thing very important is the inappropriate communication and dissemination of warning usually result in inappropriate response. So historically, if you see also, like more failure in early warning system has occurred due to the miscommunication, not equipment or infrastructure failure. So what does this suggest is that further underscore the gravity of this element, that the dissemination. So we have to take care that the inappropriate communication and dissemination of warning usually results in inappropriate response. So we have to take care that the message that is going, the warning that is going, it needs to be very clear. So for that, the message and information that passes from one level to another, whether that is vertical or the horizontal, should be very clear, so that the recipient of the message, they can act very promptly. Because in disaster situations, when you are releasing early warning, in some, suppose in case of fast floods and all, the time is very important. Sometimes we don't have that much lead time. For cyclone, definitely we have some lead time, but in some of the disasters, the lead time is very short. So the community who receives the message, who receives that information, the message should be very clear, and it should have all the information, so that at one go they can understand what the warning is about. So basically for that, we say that the early warning should cover the 5 W's and 1 H. That is, who is it about, what is going to happen, where, when it will take place, where it will take place, and why will it happen. And how sometimes some authors also add how to the list, but how, if you know what, when, like what, when, and where, this how question is automatically answered. And the last component without which the early warning system is not completed is the response capacity. Though as a human being, we can prepare, or we can try to mitigate, or we can reduce the occurrence, or we can try to reduce the impact of disaster, but we cannot stop disaster. So the last component that should be considered in all early warning system plan is the response capacity. Because to success in prompting and response to warning, it is very vital that the endangered community particularly have trust in the early warning system. In fact, the response can be undermined if warning system are repeatedly called. Suppose when there was no need for releasing the response or the warning. So false warning can also reduce the community faith from like institutions. So we need to take very careful. We need to be very careful when you are really when there are early warnings released, because how the community will take that information, and that is also very important. And to increase the community role in and how the community can respond to that to the early warning release, I think it is very vital that endangered community have a trust in a early warning system. So in fact, response can be undermined if warning system repeatedly call for action. So what they can do is we need to do more of like through mock drills and trainings particularly, or by providing a checklist also of action to undertake in certain situations. The direct campaign to raise the perception are also an example of how to increase awareness. Response capacity also need to be taken into consideration in the fact that all people should receive the same protection regardless of the gender, the age, the education, or the disability. An additional factor that must underpin a risk information like informed society is in order to issue and properly respond to early warning system is the institutional capacity also. Uh, and we have to think about increasing and enhancing our cooperation and coordination among all the institutions. So, for example, let us say that the early warning system has to be understood as an assemble of different components to inform the community in a very timely manner about the imminent threats. For example, you take this the flood early warning system here. Just example uses different types of data inputs: the satellite imagery, the radar, rain radar, the precipitation monitoring for flood models, etc., to give us a forecast and flood hazard map. And these map are used to classify imminent flood threats into 4 danger levels, and the inhabitant are then made aware of the impending threats through different medias that we have discussed in dissemination section, and are in turn encouraged to seek further information on the dedicated websites or other source of wherever the source of information is available. So what we understand is that effective end-to-end and people-centered early warning system may include the 4 interrelated key element that we just discussed. That is disaster risk knowledge based on the systematic collection of data and the disaster risk assessment. The second that we discussed was the detection, monitoring, analyzing, and forecasting of hazard and the possible consequences. And the third one was the dissemination and the communications and action of the actionable warning and associated information on the likelihood and the impacts. And the fourth one was the preparedness at all levels to respond to the warning received. These four the integrated component needs to be coordinated within within and also the across the various sectors and at multiple level for the system to work effectively, and to include an feedback mechanism for continuous improvement also, because change is the only constant. We cannot keep have our mechanism constant. We need to continuously change it. We need to continuously improve it. So that is how we will keep up with the time, and we will keep up with the increasing frequency of disasters. And failure in any one of the component that we discuss, or a lack of coordination across them, could lead to the failure of the whole system. uh, Various this thing Dr. Hajit already also discussed, like the government of India has designated special agencies to monitor the onset of different disasters and set up adequate early warning systems, and different agencies are given different disaster to give the early warning and like early warning forecasting. So I won't discuss in this detail. So just few more things that I will just like to highlight, that there are a range of the overarching issues that should be taken into account when designing and maintaining the effective early warning system. The first one definitely is the effective governance and institutional arrangement, because well-developed governance and institutional arrangement, it will support the successful development and sustainability of sound early warning and system. Whether that is vertical or horizontal communication and coordination between early warning like stakeholders should be established. Okay, and that can be more enhanced through more and more of mock drills. Uh, Multi-hazard approach also, wherever possible, early warning system, it should be linked with all hazard bed system, because one particular area can be vulnerable to multiple hazards. And so rather than installing one early warning system for each hazard, a more dynamic and more more early warning, a multi-hazard early warning system can be more beneficial for the society. And also the involvement of local community. The people-centered early warning system, it relies on the direct participation of those who most likely are to be exposed to hazards. So without the involvement of the local authorities and communities, those who are at risk, the government out there and the institutional interventions and response to hazard events, they are likely, the actions that the government takes, they are likely to be inadequate. So and the local bottom up approach to early warning, with the active participation of the local community, and the which it will also enables a multi-dimensional response to problems and needs. And in this way, the local community, also the civic groups, the traditional structures can contribute to the reduction of the vulnerability and to strengthen our local capacities. And the last point, like I also discussed in the earlier, the consideration of gender perspective and cultural diversity is also a need of the hour. So to achieve this, there are several key actors who definitely play a very important role. So developing and implementing an effective early warning system, it requires the contribution and coordination of a diverse range of individuals and groups. It is not an one man game or a one team game. So it will need the help and contribution from all the people. So whether that is community itself, like we have discussed, or that is the local government, or the central government, the regional institutions, the international bodies, the NGOs, the private sector, particularly in risks, in getting more information about the risk, or vital, they can also play a very important role in improving the disaster consciousness of the general population and disseminating early warning system. The survey, the science and academic community also, they have a very important role in providing the specific scientific and technical inputs to assist the government and the community in developing more effective early warning system. So to end my presentation, some of the way forward that I would like to highlight is like there is a requirement for strengthening our disaster risk governance, and public and private investment in disaster risk prevention and reduction through this, whether that is structural or non-structural measure, needs to be stepped up to create more disaster resilient society. We also need to be focused in sharing of knowledge and information in local language, also to reach the people residing in remote areas where the limited understanding of our Hindi and English language in their own vernacular language. That needs to also be thought about. And also the technological innovation, broadcasting techniques and system for use in emergency communication needs to be continuously improved. So with this, my presentation is over. I would like to take some questions if there are. Just let me go. Cannot see any questions. So if you have any questions, actually I cannot access the chat box right now. Just If there are any questions, I will take that questions also. I will get back to you for that. So with that being said, we have come to the first end of the first day of training program. So overall, we had a very informative day where we learned about the the basics of disaster management, and we learned about the HVCR from Dr. Harjeet Kaur, and later on Dr. Hari Kumar sir given very detailed presentations about the earthquake related disaster, particularly focusing in hilly areas, and he has shared his rich experience of working in hilly areas. So in the end, I am very thankful to all the speakers of today's session, and I'm also very much thankful to our patrons of these programs, our executive director, Major General Manoj Kumar Bindal, and also from Nagaland SDMA side for contributing and for also supporting to jointly organize this program. And we must also thank our chair of this training program, Professor Surya Prakash, who is always there to guide us and support us in any of our endeavors. And of course, I would also like to thank my colleague, Dr. Harjeet Kaur, Sri Anil Kathed, Hari Hara Kumar, Ajit Batham, and others who were a part of this program, and also our IT team, Balaji, Gaurav, Sovit, for assisting us in coordinating this program. And definitely, needless to mention, I'm very much thankful to all the delegates, all the participants who has joined us, because without your participation, this whole thing would not mean anything. So I would like to thank everybody, and I will request you to kindly join us again tomorrow for a very exciting discussions where we will be talking about various. Today we have learned the basics. Tomorrow we will go in a little more detail. We will try to understand a lecture about the landslides particularly, and also the incident response system once the disaster has happened, how the starting carried out. So tomorrow will be a very interesting session. So I'll request you kindly use the same link to join us tomorrow. And for certificate, it is very mandatory to join us in all the 3 programs. So in that aspect also. So I would like to sign off for today's session. So thank you everybody for joining us. Let us again meet us tomorrow using the same link, same time. Thank you very much.